Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the fifth of our Jubilee Talks. This evening's talk is the second appearance of Dr. Cormac McSparron in the series. Cormac studied undergraduate archaeology and modern history at Queen's University before completing an MPhil on the medieval coarse pottery of Ulster and a PhD looking at statistical analysis of the single burial traditions in early Bronze Age Ireland and some implications for social structure. After working for the Environment and Heritage Service and private sector rescue archaeology, he joined the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork at Queen's as a research fellow in 2002. During his last talk, Cormac explored in some depth the interrelationship of prehistoric and early historic Ireland and Scotland. This evening, he'll be looking more broadly at royal sites across the north of Ireland, from Donegal, Derry, Londonderry, and North Antrim. When and by whom were these settlements built, and what functions do they perform? That's what we are here to find out. So I will hand over, Cormac, to you if you'd like to share your screen.
Yes. I think that's... Can everyone see that? Should be a nice satellite picture of North Ulster, yes?
Yes, yep, we can see that.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to turn off my camera in a minute to save bandwidth, but tonight I'm going to talk about some of the royal sites, certainly, and most of the royal sites of the north coast of Ulster. And well, there's three royal sites really, and two kind of also rans that have an important part of the story to tell. Two of the sites, through 2.5 of the sites have been subject to archaeological excavation, and a couple of the sites are awaiting, hopefully in the not too distant future, some reasonably intensive archaeological investigations. Hopefully not too invasive, but hopefully we will be able to answer some of the questions that we might pose tonight. But I'm going to focus on both the physical archaeology, both the structures that survive, and also what has been found by archaeological investigations, and also the historic backdrops to these sites, why we know about them, why we know about their significance, and in one or two places I'm going to try and link them to wider themes in archaeology and history of these islands. The first site I want to talk about is one that's not terribly well known. It's not terribly well known because of its proximity to another spectacularly situated site called the Greenan, or sometimes called the Greenan of Aileach. But this site is a place called Aileach Castle, sometimes called Doherty's Tower, because in the later Middle Ages, the O'Doherty family had their chief residence here. The lords of the O'Doherty family had their chief residence here. But it's the place name and the other name, which is also known as Ella, and the place name, Ella Moor or Aileach Moor, gives an indication that actually this may well be the site of the famed Aileach, which is sometimes appended on to the famous Greenan of Aileach monument, which is a few miles away across the Derry, Londonderry, Donegal border. Here's a Google Earth snap of Derry City, and you can see Aileach Castle just to the east side of the border there, the yellow border, and the Greenan of Aileach a few kilometres, a few miles to the southwest. And of course, the Greenan of Aileach is a particularly iconic monument. People see it all the time as they drive into Donegal. It's spectacularly situated on top of a very high mountain. It has, well, both been quite well preserved and also quite extensively restored in the 19th century, although not so restored that it's destroyed the character of it. And it's probably not a surprise that people believe it's the pre-eminent site in the area. But probably part of the reason why we believe it's the pre-eminent site in the area is because it's fossilized in time in the early Middle Ages, whereas Aileach Castle, Aileach Moor, underwent several different revisions and reconstructions, and eventually was demolished in the post the post 1690 period, and the stone was taken and used in other buildings. So we only see a fraction at Aileach Castle of what was once there. But the question has been asked many times over the years. Which is the real site of Aileach? And Aileach, as I'll discuss in a little more detail in a few minutes, is a name which has tremendous resonance from very early times in Ireland. If you go back to the early Middle Ages, when there was a high kingship or a kingship of Tara across the whole of Ireland, it was more of an overlordship rather than a sovereign kingship in the later medieval sense of the word. It was very much an early medieval kingship, and that suzerainty, I suppose you would call it, had an official deputy post, if you like, or king in waiting post, and that king in waiting was referred to as the King of Aileach. Aileach was a term which was used specifically to mean Aileach itself, the site. It was poetically used to mean the whole northern half of the island in some documents, and was also the term which was given to the number two aristocrat, the number two king, the deputy king underneath the high king. So it was used in many different ways, and it has been a debate amongst archaeologists and historians and antiquarians for nearly 200 years now, ever since Colonel Colby in the Ordnance Survey, first Ordnance Survey of Ireland, fixed the Greenan as the site of Aileach. And the reasons which he did so, I'll discuss in more detail in a minute or two, but it was, I think, as much because Colonel Colby, he was a fascinating individual, an English army colonel who had come to Ireland with the Ordnance Survey and became absolutely transfixed by the history and archaeology, and became a tremendous advocate for the archaeology of Ireland in the 19th century. And he just simply got taken, I think, to the romance of the Greenan and decided it must be Aileach. It can't be that horrible little crumbling pile just outside the city. But there has been quite a lot of investigation of Aileach, or Aileach Castle rather. I'll not call it Aileach, just in case I'm wrong, until the end anyway. But there has been quite a lot of intensive investigation of Aileach Castle over the past few years, and both done by the Historic Environment Division, as it's now called, or as it was a few years ago, the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, and by ourselves in Queen's in partnership. The image here I want to show you is an image of Aileach Castle made by Lidar. And Lidar is a fascinating technique, very useful technique, which archaeologists have at their disposal nowadays. Lidar is laser radar, basically. It fires thousands of beams, billions of beams of light at a surface, and as the light beams beam back, the angle and the time that it takes the light beams to beam back is used to build up, if you like, a radar type image, a 3D model of the surface. Although the trees haven't been removed here, they've been kept on to give it some sort of context. It's possible to take off undergrowth with LiDAR because, of course, if you fire enough billions of rays at anything, in any canopy, a few beams will make their way through and bounce back to allow you to make some sort of a basic survey, even under undergrowth. And it's particularly good at cutting through light undergrowth, like long grass and things like that. So this is a LiDAR survey, and you can see the central area here is a big rocky outcrop. It's about 35 meters one way by about 28 meters the other way. And if you see here, there's just a little semicircle. That is a single surviving castle tower. And I think there's a drawing of it made in 1803, a lovely drawing by Captain Willoughby Smith. It hasn't changed significantly since then, but that is the only piece surviving of a much larger medieval castle, which sits upon a site that has tremendous antiquity. We now know has tremendous antiquity from our work over recent years. Aileach Castle is mentioned. There are a lot of references to Aileach Castle Aileach, rather than a castle. Aileach is mentioned many times in medieval texts and records. As I'm sure you're probably aware, we're very lucky in the history and archaeology of Ireland in that there is a profusion of early medieval Gaelic texts. It's estimated that there are more surviving pages of early medieval Gaelic than there are of all the other European languages apart from Greek and Roman put together. So it's a huge body of information there which can be mined. A lot of it is very difficult to use, and to be honest, some of the places and individuals have never actually been entirely tied down, especially some of the places have never been tied down. But we're very lucky that Aileach has a name which is distinctive, and although it has been appended with various different other names attached to it at various times, the Aileach element has always remained, and it allows us to fairly easily identify it in these medieval texts. One set of texts is called the metrical Densianicus, and the metrical Densianicus, it's really just a series of poems, hence metrical. Densianicus means kind of like old place name lore. And this was a set of poems which were compiled in the 11th and 12th century by monks. Something like 180 odd poems were compiled. And I think it was slightly over 200, I think, poems were compiled in the 11th and 12th century by a series of monastic antiquarians, essentially, not doing. Well, if it wasn't their day job, or if they were doing their day job, they were doing something that they maybe shouldn't have been doing, but they were very much focused on secular literature, and they compiled this body of place name knowledge, or knowledge of stories of places about the then most prominent places in the Irish landscape. And there are 3 poems which are devoted to Aileach, and they're fascinating poems for what they say. To be honest with you, the accounts are quite similar in all 3 poems. The first poem, but all poems actually mention that the origin of focus of interest on the site comes from the slaying of a guy called Ebbed, who was the son of the Dagda, who's sometimes called the good god, who's a sort of a semi-mythological king stroke god character in the prehistoric era. He may never actually have existed, of course, or if he existed, his memory has been probably very much altered by generations of retelling. But if you believe the early medieval chronologies, the Dagda and Ed and the other characters in this story exist around about 1800 BC, which would be in our early Bronze Age period, which, interestingly enough, has been in recent years identified by radiocarbon analysis and DNA analysis as a period of time, probably shortly after a major migration from Northern Europe and Northern and Central Europe into both Ireland and Britain as well. So there may be a reason why there were memories of big changes around 1800 BC. But anyway, Ed is slain, and the slayer, Corgand, vows to make some sort of amends to his father, builds this, constructs a tomb for Ed at the site of Aileach, and his death cry is supposed to be Aileach when he constructs the tomb. This seems very fanciful. Most likely the people who were composing the poem or writing down the poem or annotating and commenting the poem, monastic commenters or whoever, simply didn't know what the original meaning of Aileach was, or they were hiding the original meaning of Aileach. Aileach is, of course, quite close to the area of Derry, which is sometimes called Galia, which is translated as being reference to Cailleach, as an old woman, and it's sometimes suggested there was a convent in Derry, and that was likely a reference to the convent. Of course, there is the Cailleach Bearach, who is a mythological character in Irish and Scottish legend, and the Cailleach Bearach is another possibility as the element of Aileach coming from. The poems suggested that then once the tomb was built, or after a period of time, that the site was fortified by Imchal, who's sometimes called the castle builder. and that the place became sacred to the war gods. The poem also mentions a second name for Aileach, Aileach Frigrin, and it's very interesting about this Aileach Frigrin is it's named after Frigru, a Pict, and also because of Aileach, the daughter of the King of Scotland, who eloped with Frigru and came to Ireland. The first poem also tells us that St. Patrick went to Aileach, and he there met Owen, one of the important kings of the northern Ideal, of whom the later Kinnell Owen, from whom the O'Neills, very complicated, are descended, and the McLaughlins are descended. That this Owen was told by Patrick that a sort of a prophecy that his people would now own Aileach. And this was in the 450s or something like that, AD. Almost certainly this is fanciful as well, and a later piece of political interpretation or interpolation, because to be honest, in the 5th century, the Ineal did not control this area. They were farther to the west, and this area would have been controlled by some variant of the Ulster men, the Ullad or the Cruithne in this period of time. The third poem adds a little bit of extra detail. It mentions that the reason for the fight between Ed and Corgent, and possibly the reason why the Dagda didn't have Ed immediately executed, was because Corgan didn't have Corgan executed, is because Ed had seduced Corgan's wife, and that was the motive. So it was a crime of passion, and that's the reason why the Dagda didn't automatically have him killed and allowed Corgan to make amends by constructing the tomb. And it also mentions a little more details about the ramparts around Aileach, and says that these are fantastic ramparts, the best ramparts in Ireland. And it mentions again the castle builder Imkel and another individual called Garvin. There is another poem. I've said poem 4. It should be poem 2, but I did them deliberately out of sequence, and my presentation software has automatically called it 4. But in this poem, I only mention it for one reason, because it's exactly the same, more or less, as the other poems, is that it's later. And Flann, the lector of Munster Voice, who died in the mid-11th century, apologises for repeating the more ancient poems. But it gives us a terminus antiquem, a time before which these poems had to be written. They had to be written before the 11th century, the original poems, if there was a copyist copying and apologising for copying earlier poems, writing in the mid-11th century. So it shows that they have some antiquity, although they talk about much, much, much older events. And of course, from various different sources, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, the Lore Gabla, the Owls and the Four Masters, even the late 17th, early 18th century historian Geoffrey Keating, all mention similar episodes associated with Ella Castle and some of these other royal sites in very ancient times. There was a body of ancient lore and ancient documents which they were all drawing upon. My new retriever puppy has just jumped into the room. I hope she's not going to bark, just disrupt us. But this slide says much of what I've mentioned. These events are very ancient. They predate the Christian. Hold on, I'll get someone to take her away. Cured, problem solved. Kids have got it. Very ancient events commencing around about 1800 BC, if you believe those ancient semi-mythological or maybe completely mythological chronologies. There are a number of analytic references to Aileach. At a certain point in time, around about 800 AD, the medieval Irish annals become pretty accurate, maybe around 700 AD, become pretty accurate. Before a certain point in time, you can sort of detect that they're remembering stuff and writing it down. And after a certain point, in the 8th century. They're actually writing it down as it happens. So a lot of the action, if you like, in the Irish annals from around about or shortly before 700 is pretty much on the nose what happened and in its year. And there's broad agreement between the various different documentary sources. However, slightly before that, things tend to be, well, one, very ancient stuff's mythological, and more recent history at around the time that the annals are beginning to be compiled is sort of gets a little bit of an edit and a spin. I mean, it all gets an edit and a spin. All these, like all histories, even modern history, has, no matter how impartial it tries to be, always has a position, however unconscious, and that's as much true for the early medieval Irish records as anywhere. But Aileach is mentioned in the Annals of Tiernach for 489, and it again mentions an Uneal king of Aileach. In this case, Murkertach, son of Eric, who's king of Aileach in the 5th century and was killed in battle. And this is probably a later political interpolation to try and push back the Uneal ownership of that part of West Ulster beyond when they actually did own it. The real point when it's most likely that the Uneal really moved across Ulster is in the 7th century. And in 676, the Annals of Ulster mention the destruction of Aileach Frigran by Fenechta. And Fenechta was a member of the Uneal. It's interesting they use the term Aileach Frigran, and after this point in time, they always just call it Aileach, because of course Frigran was the name of a Pict, and as some historians like Owen McNeill have suggested, and not all agree with him, but I think Owen McNeill was onto something, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago. There is some sort of a link up between the Picts and the Cruithne. All of these early medieval dynasties are all actually pretty interrelated, but there does seem to at times have been a close relationship between the Cruithne of East Ulster and the Picts. Certainly some of the Picts, the Picti anyway. And this probably relates to that. And then once the Uneal have conquered Aileach, both Aileach in terms of the site, but also probably the whole territory of Aileach, Northwest Ulster, they start referring to it as Aileach alone and no longer as Aileach Frigran. There are a few other solid annalistic references. AD 900, there's a sacking of of Aileach by the Norse, supported by the Kinnell Owen, quite interestingly. Sorry, there's the wrong site. The sacking of Aileach in AD 900 by the foreigners, which in this case means the Norse. And then there's a second Viking attack, AD 939, on Aileach as well. And this time they take the king of Aileach at ransom for a little while. And this is one of a number of events which provokes a major offensive by the Kinnell Owen, and also the Ullad and the Cruithne all together gang up on the Norse, and they pretty much wipe them out of Ulster in the early 940s, and they never come back again. They overreach themselves in ransoming the king of Aileach, and of course their long forts on Lough Neagh and in Strangford are wiped out in coordinated attacks. I think it's in 942. And they never really come back into Ulster in any force again. There's the occasional raid on coastal targets, but they never come back in any force. Again, in 1101, there's another sacking of Aileach, but in this occasion, the Annals of the Four Masters, which is a later compilation of the Annals of Ulster, so there may be a degree of inaccuracy there, but the Annals of the Four Masters were actually compiled from other sources in the early 17th century. But they mentioned this specifically as being Green and Oleg, or the Green of Aileach. So whether that relates specifically to what we now call the Green of Aileach, the castle on the hill, or whether it's a scribal error or other confusion is difficult to say. Annalistic references keep being made to Aileach until the middle of the 13th century, and then it stops. And this is unusual why it stops so suddenly. There doesn't seem to be any real reason for it. There's no particular event, apart from one possibility is that by the 1250s, The O'Neills, as they're now becoming, the Kinlowen, the O'Neills now see themselves as not just dominant in West Ulster, but they also see that de Courcy and the subsequent Normans have effectively destroyed the MacDunleavys in East Ulster and effectively rendered the kingship of Ulster vacant. And with the kingship of Ulster vacant, the Kinlowen, the O'Neills, are deciding that they are the rightful now owners of that title. There was, although it doesn't always work, there was quite a lot of respect for lineage in early medieval Ireland. So, for instance, I think I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago that I mentioned that Brian Borough never actually, even though he was completely unchallengeable across the whole of Ireland, never used the term King of Ireland for himself because he didn't come from a royal line. It's a very high aristocratic line, but he wasn't a national royal figure. So therefore, he used the term Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Scots, rather than, embarrass himself by using a title king, which he didn't see himself able to adopt. And likewise, the O'Neills waited, it seems, possibly until the kingship of Ulster was clearly in abeyance before they took the name Kings of Ulster for themselves and stopped using the term Kings of Aileach. A couple of other references before we move on. Late Gaelic praise poetry mentions Aileach on numerous occasions. Many of them are, just in passing, mention someone who was from Aileach who gets into a spot of bother somewhere, has an interesting adventure or a love affair or something like that. But one particular poem is a little bit more detailed and tells us a little bit more. And it was written, it was a poem to Sean O'Doherty, Sir Sean O'Doherty, who's a 15th century character. And the poem discusses Aileach. And it does something very brave for a praise poet, because praise poets normally are expected to eulogize the person who's paying for the poem. But the poet eulogizes the castle and says that O'Doherty is ennobled by having this castle rather than the castle is ennobled by being the castle of O'Doherty. And it's such a brave thing to do in normal occasions. The only reason you would do it is if it was completely obvious that you were ennobled by possession of this place of great antiquity. He also gives a physical description of the castle. He describes it as having 4 towers. And he actually talks about its labyrinthine interior. And I was wondering about this. And I'm currently... myself and a colleague are currently bringing a paper to publication, hopefully later this year, about our excavations at Aileach. And he's more of a building specialist than I. And I was wondering what this meant, pondering this. And he thinks it was actually because many of these Gaelic castles had a deliberately serpentine route to get through to, if you like, the hall or the lordly residence. And it was not direct from the door, and he thinks that that's a reference to this, and you had to go around several buildings and in and out difficult areas before you actually made your way to the lordly cell or the lordly hall. So can Aileach Castle be the Greenan? And Colby has 2 tests for what's likely to be. Can the Greenan or Aileach? Can the Greenan or Aileach Castle be the site of Aileach? And Colby of the Ordnance Survey had 2 tests which he set, and the reasons why he decided that the Greenan must be the true site of Aileach. He believed that the fact that there were traces of outer enclosures at the Greenan, which you can see in the aerial photograph that we showed a few minutes ago, so a circular enclosure around it, shows that must be the wrath of goodly devices, the great enclosure that was talked about in the magical Densianicus. And since he couldn't see anything like that at Aileach Castle, he thought that was one reason why it was likely that the Greenan was the ancient site. And he also noted that the masonry remains at Aileach Castle were high Middle Ages, where those at Greenan were clearly early Middle Ages. And for those 2 reasons, he overruled the weight of other evidence, the place name evidence and other evidence, and used that to suggest that the Greenan must be the true site of Aileach, as opposed to Aileach Castle. So when we decided we were going to dig there in 2013 as part of the Derry Londonderry City of Culture year, those were the questions which we were hoping to answer. Just here, Ashby's map, just before we move on, Ashby's map depicts Derry. You can see Derry there, and you can see Culmore Fort to the left of Derry, and Donalong to the right of Derry. And then you'll just notice to I suppose you would say the bottom left of Derry, there's a sort of little four-tarred structure, and there's a close-up of it in the larger map, and you can see that there are 4 towers surrounded by some sort of a wall with a couple of buildings in the interior. There's a road leading up to it, and the road seems to be flanked with trees. Now, again, my colleague Paul Logue that I'm publishing this with, he's of the opinion that is probably a formal garden being represented there. Just he's seen that convention used before on sketch maps of that era. There may have been a formal garden outside the castle. There is a key for this map, and the key has C and then LO. ELO, which we think is the map maker's attempt at pronouncing Ella, was to pronounce it spell it ELO. In advance of our investigation, we carried out a geophysical survey. The geophysical survey was quite difficult. We tried magnetometry initially, which was not entirely successful, probably because of the presence of huge amounts of basalt in the area, and it was causing a magnetic sort of charge, which we were having difficulty with. But we conducted a resistivity survey as well, and the resistivity survey showed a number of anomalies. If you can follow my mouse, if you can see my mouse, there's a curving black anomaly, which is running here. There was also an interesting black anomaly here and a white thing running around like this. We decided to excavate in 3 areas. We decided to test this anomaly. We decided to test this anomaly. And we also had an interesting hollow and bank, on the top of the mound, which we wanted to test as well. Tiny trenches for the size of the site, but archaeology has to be careful. It's better to take a number of small bites at something to properly understand it and ponder in between. And also, of course, you have to realize that these are irreplaceable monuments, and every time we excavate, we to some extent destroy some of the evidence that's there. So we decided to excavate as small an area as we could, and we had a team made up of Queen's staff and volunteers from the local community, many retired people, and a few students, and it was actually a wonderful project. This is a Lidar image of Ella Castle from slightly farther out than the other one that you can see, just to put it into its sort of geographical context. There is now a range of buildings constructed around it, several farm buildings, and quite a lot of the stone from the castle is probably in these buildings. And there's just another close-up again before we move on. You probably see my mouse, that was the odd thing which we decided, one of the things we decided to test on with our trenches, the one on the top of the mound. Our first trench, this is our first trench. I'll go back and show you what this is. This is the trench 3, actually. There's a reason why the first trench is trench 3. We tried a little couple of just soundings, really, just to see depth of strata, 1 meter by 1 meter things, which were called trench 1 and 2. So our first trench is trench 3, and that's the one that targeted the black anomaly. And this was a low resistance anomaly. So we were expecting to find some sort of negative feature, if you like, something which was dug into the ground and filled with softer, wetter material. So that's why we targeted that location. And this is an aerial photograph of the results. You can probably see at the left-hand side of the picture here that the trench is diving down into the ground. And also you probably see the stone wall, and you may be able to see some of these stones of darker earth to the right side of the monument. This is a ditch, or as we would call it in the vernacular in Ulster, a shach. a deep shoch, a deep ditch dug into the ground, and then the material from the ditch was cast up to make a bank, and the bank was faced on the certainly on the inside by this dry stone wall, and then on the inside of the dry stone wall there is actually a rather disturbed but originally probably quite well paved surface. Here's a photograph to show the ditch. We did not bottom the ditch. We took the ditch to a depth of 1.5 meters, and then we had to stop, as I say, especially with a team of volunteers. We didn't want to put them in harm's way, and to have done this safely, we would have had to have extended the excavation quite a lot because of the risks of trench wall collapse. So we paused the excavation at 1.5 meters, but we did establish that there was a ditch and a bank, and a ditch and a bank and a stone facing on the inside of it. You can see the profile here. Now, if you follow the mouse, this is the unexcavated portion. This is the subsoil. This has been cut away to make the ditch. And this is the old ground surface here, above the number 309. So this was the old ground surface. Then it was cut away, cut through the topsoil, down into the subsoil to make a ditch, which, well, was 1 meter, 1.5 meter from the modern surface, probably going to be quite a lot deeper before it's actually bottomed. In addition to the, sorry, by the way, this material here, 305, it is the material which was cast up from the ditch during the ditch's digging, which was revetted with this dry stone wall on the inside. This probably originally would have been 2 or 3 meters tall, revetted with dry stone on this side, and actually from the amount of well cut stone we found in the ditch itself, probably revetted on both sides with stone, but tumbled in at some stage, filled in, and only this relic, sort of half a meter hump of the original bank left. As I mentioned, 309 is the old ground surface. The ground surface before the ditch was dug. We did find some features, as you can see, under the ground surface, and they took the form of stake holes and pits. I have a photograph of some of the stake holes and pits here. Excuse me, photograph taken by Bettina Linker, a very talented photographer based in Derry, who took many photographs for us on the excavation. And this, you can see here, several little post holes or stake holes, and a number of larger, well, they could be post holes. The ones with stone packing, the ones without stone packing are pits for some other purpose. And the one without stone packing, you probably see a black shadow there. There was a lot of charcoal in. Where we're going. Yes, so up onto the top of the mound, I mentioned at the top of the mound, there was an unusual hump of earth, and we wondered what it was, so we stuck a section through it here. The hump of earth actually turned out to be cast up material from a gully which was running in this direction. We're not sure what function it had, but the material infill was very modern. It's possible that it was disturbance by treasure hunters or something like that. The backfill was mostly 20th century rubbish, late 19th and early 20th century rubbish. Nothing really after the sort of starting the Second World War, all pre-Second World War. And then we also found this lovely piece of masonry, which has been badly disturbed by also the digging of another more disturbance here, although this disturbance seemed to be 17th or 18th century. And we found a packed stone surface here. You can see these packed stones. We took a section through it, of course, to see its depth and see what it was set onto, but it just seems to have been set onto something quite like the subsoil, but with a few depressions in it, maybe where stones, natural stones, have been cleared away to make this packed stone surface. We found very little dating evidence in this packed stone surface. There was pressed into the top of it some 17th century pottery, and we know that Sir Arthur Chichester's men were camped here for some time in the early 17th century, so it's possible that some of that material got pressed into an earlier medieval floor, a rough sort of castle yard floor, excuse me, at that stage. And we found nothing, unfortunately, to date this masonry structure. But of course, we were very reluctant to remove this masonry structure. This was a scheduled monument. It's got a special level of protection. And I did say, as part of the scheduling conditions, that we would do our best not to disturb any solid masonry remains that we found. We would dig to them, but really no further. So we weren't able to really establish a date for this masonry structure. The other trench, which we dug, and I'm just going to go back just a slide or two, was Trench 5, which was to the northeast of the site. Trench 5, we dug because, well, again, we could see a big sort of geophysical anomaly, which we thought was going to be a cut into the earth holding material. And, well, the geophysics was accurate. We did find right at the end of the trench, we found this big deep depression filled with large amounts of stone. Unfortunately, again, the excavation, we had not the time or the resources to fully engage with this. And it's something we would very much like to do, is to come back and excavate further here and see what this big, deep depression filled with large stones was. We can only imagine it was some sort of footing for a large stone structure which has been removed above ground, and all that's left is the foundation. And we were just lucky enough to clip it, but unlucky enough to actually clip it enough to see what it was. We got a series of radiocarbon dates, which you can't really see very well because the text is dark. A couple of radiocarbon dates. We got one radiocarbon date from layer 309, where layer 309 joined the 305, the bank material from the construction of the enclosure around the monument. That date was from hazelnut shells, and the date was 407 AD to 532 AD. So we have a patrician period site here in all probability. We also got a second radiocarbon date from the pit, which was under the old ground surface, and it was quite surprising in that it was a clearly Iron Age date, 3rd to early 5th century AD. We think that material, that Iron Age material, is intrusive, has made its way somehow into this pit, and the reason being is because we also found in this pit a few tiny fragments, and I haven't a good photograph with me tonight. I haven't been over in my office very much recently, and I meant to grab a good microscopic photograph of these tiny glass fragments, but they're threads of Millefiori. And Millefiori is a classical Roman glassworking technique, which would be unlikely to be seen in Northern Europe really before the sort of 5th century, certainly in Ireland before the 5th century AD. I know in the Mediterranean you do get it in the Iron Age, but I think it's unlikely that it isn't early medieval in this case, and probably dates to the 5th century AD. And Iron Age charcoal, it was a charcoal date, from somewhere else in the site has managed to make its way into here, possibly when being disturbed when it was actually dug in the first place, when they were digging this pit for whatever, or post hole for whatever purpose it was dug. But nevertheless, we can say two things. We can say that it's likely that the construction of the bank and ditch is around the 5th or very early 6th century AD, and we can say that there was Iron Age activity in the general Aileach area. So we can say a few things now. I'll go back to the Geophysical Survey again, the overview. We have detected a large enclosure. Extrapolating from the Geophysical Survey, we would imagine that this enclosure must, if it's a bank and ditch around the entire site, must have a diameter of around about 100 meters, which makes it about the same size actually as the enclosure closing bank and ditch around the Green and the Aileach. But it certainly suggests that the qualification, the disqualification that Colby said of Ella Castle being the location of Aileach is no longer valid, at least on that account, in that there certainly was an enclosure around the site. And the other thing being is the early medieval date of Greenan as opposed to Aileach, or Greenan as opposed to Ella Castle. But it is clear from our radiocarbon dates and from even the very form of our early medieval bank and ditch that Aileach, that Ella Castle has an origin in the early medieval period as well. And I think that the balance of probabilities now, along with the praise poetry as well, and other aspects of the siting and location of Ella Castle, which we could talk about as we go on, probably makes it very likely to be the original location or original site of Aileach. So I'm going to move on now, and what way am I going with these slides? No, that's the wrong way. I'm going to move on and talk about another site called the Giant Sconce. The Giant Sconce is located about 8 miles from Coleraine on the Limavady Valley Coleraine road, and it's a very, very interesting fortification essentially, and it, like Ella Castle, has some very ancient origin stories, or not so much origin stories, but very ancient stories associated with it. And it's a site about which, apart from these few references, practically nothing is known, because there's never been any archaeological investigation of significance there. There was, however, quite a lot of damage done by antiquarians or treasure, maybe not even antiquarians, but treasure hunters back in the early 19th century. I thought this image was a little bit clearer than it was, but you probably can see there's a huge amount of actually massive disturbed dry stone walling all around the site. And the site is, again, a bit like Ella Castle, is a big rocky outcrop, but this rocky outcrop has two areas. It has an upper range, if you like, and it's got a lower range. And this is something which is seen quite a lot, and it's in important sites in both Ireland and in the west of Scotland, and more so in Scotland. There are only a few sites in Ireland like this, and they're all concentrated in Ulster. And but the split level here is probably partly because of the site has been chosen for this split level, but there's also probably a degree of enhancement. And one of the sites we're going to talk about in a wee while shows something similar, and was clearly deliberately enhanced to create this inner ward and outer ward, if you like, effect. This is again a Lidar survey, some great Lidar surveys that have been carried out by the Historic Environment Division in recent years, and which incidentally it's free to download the raw data, and it's surprisingly easy to process yourself if you're interested in this sort of stuff. There are instructions on the internet as to how to process LiDAR, and it's not as difficult as you might first think. You can very clearly here see the two-level effect of the site, the fact that it's constructed on a rocky outcrop, and also this very interesting and large wall. The Ordnance Survey memoirs note that this is this wall originally, before it was destroyed or at least damaged badly by treasure hunters, had an intramural passage. An intramural passage is basically inside the wall. And there aren't many sites in Ireland which have intramural passages. Interestingly enough, the Greenan has an intramural passage, and there are a couple of southwestern cashels in sort of Munster have intramural passages, but they're quite common things on Scottish dunes, which is something we mentioned a few weeks ago. Quite common in Scottish dunes, and certainly Richard Warner, former curator of the Ulster Museum, has drawn attention to this in his work in the past, and has made a number of interesting suggestions about, again, the continued interplay, of course, across the North Channel, and the intramural passages in both the Greenan and at the Giant Sconce. My colleague Thomas McLean, formerly of the University of Ulster Maritime Archaeology Unit, Coleraine, has done a great job, actually, at convincingly establishing that the giant sconce is a site which is mentioned in many, many very early tales. It has two names in these early tales, Duncathrine and Dundabend. And both of these sites are mentioned, well, Catherine is, or Cairn is a major character in the Ulster cycle legends. He is regularly listed as one of the most important lords between Mulcullion, the cattle rate of Cooley. And Dundabend, he's mentioned in association with both Duncathrine and Dundabend. His wife is mentioned in association with both of them. Their son is mentioned in association with both of them. And when Thomas has looked at the descriptions of both sites and the locations, it's just two names for the same site. One named after Cairn, the other name seems obscure, or there's no one is entirely certain. Dundabend, excuse me, is also specifically mentioned in the Mescaulin, one of the Ulster cycle tales, the preamble tales to the town of Mulcullion, as a royal fort. They specifically say it's a royal fort. They mention it as only one of a few royal forts in Ulster. The others, off the top of my head, I think they mentioned in that are Downpatrick and Ulnach, I think, in Mescaulin. They don't mention Aileach, which is interesting. But these stories have knocked around for many, many centuries, have been rewritten, and they're often rewritten with a quite political eye. And certainly the early medieval rivals of the people who composed the town Mulcullion, so one monk against another monk, said, "Oh, you only give the Ulstermen such a good tale because they were paying you to write it." Is an accusation that was actually made in early medieval texts about the town by others. So it maybe didn't mention Aileach for a reason, because they were at war with them at the time. But in its form, as I mentioned, it's a fortified outcrop with an outer enclosure. And it really does have parallels with some of the Scottish nuclear forts. There's one in particular, that the capital of Scottish Dal Riada is called Donnard. And I thought I had a picture of Donnard, actually. Oh, yes, I thought a photograph, but I've just got this image of Donnard, a survey of Donnard from Glasgow University did a few years ago. Hope they don't mind me borrowing it, but I've mentioned it, so that's almost copyright, isn't it? Copyright. And you can see that it has a very similar form. It's a fortified outcrop with a central sort of enclosure, and then a couple of loping off enclosures to either side. So the same kind of idea. Of course, you're limited by your hill. You have to follow the form of your hill. You can enhance it, but you can't create it in its entirety. And the giant sconce, yes, a bit like there's always a prophecy. All of these most important sites have a prophecy associated with them. And in the case of the giant sconce, it's no different from any other. The giant sconce is the location of an encounter, a story that's told by an encounter between Columcille and St. Colmcille. They're both returning from the Synod of Drumcat. The Synod of Drumcat 575 was, well, at least the official story. The historians have debated now. There's always a historical analysis of all these things, but the traditional story of the Synod of Drumcat is that one of the big things they're doing is sorting out the relationships between Ireland and Scotland in the period after the Dal Riada have broken the seal, if you like, and established a colony in Scotland, which seems to be having significant effects and achieving significant levels of political power. And they have the Synod of Drumcat to work out the legalistic niceties of how that's all going to work. And on the way back from Drumcat, Columcille and Colmcille stop off for tea at Duncathrine. And Columcille is an interesting saint because he's not, in some respects, he's not very saintly, you know. I mean, he's a historical figure, and we do know he was a major aristocrat amongst the highest level of the O'Neill. It's not, but he could easily have been King of Aileach himself if he had made different choices in his life. And he was no stranger to violence, at least in his early career. There's a great story actually about Columcille when they were building the churches, one of the Scottish Isles, and I think it's Hinba, the one in Hinba, and they couldn't get the church built. And one of the monks said, you know, that's because we haven't carried out a human sacrifice yet. And Columcille went, are you sure? And the monk says, yeah, absolutely, that's the tradition. So Columcille went, okay, you know. And they killed someone, one of the junior monks, and put them into the foundations of the church. And apparently they realized after a minute or two that the guy wasn't dead. So the story says Columcille came over with a shovel and dispatched them properly. But anyway, that's one blood-curdling tale about Columcille. There's another blood-curdling tale about Columcille. While they were having their tea, Columcille mentioned to Colmcille that in the future, your people and my people are going to have a terrible battle here, and your people are going to be totally wiped out. And the well at Duncathrine will run red with their blood, was what he apparently said to them. And there is, in fact, a battle. There are several battles where the Aileach are attacking the Cruithne at Duncathrine, but they finally defeat them in the Battle of 680. Well, it's either 679 or 681, depending on which analytic source you believe. 681, the Earls of Ulster, and the Aileach finally take control of the fort and the surrounding territory. They actually probably destroy the fort because there are no further references really to the fort being used. Of course, as with a lot of these tales, Columcille probably didn't have that blood-curdling conversation with Colmcille, just like the later sort of fantastical saint's tale. He probably didn't sacrifice a guy and then dispatch him with a shovel. But this story has been written after the event to again give weight to the Aileach ownership of East County Derry / Londonderry, as the Aileach are pushing across, and they're co-opting religious authority, ideology, if you like, and getting saints' lives writers like Adavan, like Tiracon, as we'll talk about in a minute or two, to write stories for them that reinforce the current political reality, and use that ideological force to make it more difficult to overturn that current political reality. And this is, of course, only a few years after the destruction of Aileach Frigran. So you're really seeing the wave of the Aileach passing across West Ulster here in these few years. And all the earlier references to Owen or whoever at Aileach, and in fact there are similar references to Duncathrine, which I haven't mentioned. They're all really just attempts to back project that late 7th century reality into the sort of 5th or 6th century era. The visible on the ground today at this site, it's very disturbed. You can still see the huge dry stone walls. There is some sort of a well on the mound, on the rock, and there is a depression which might just be a collapsed souterrain. If there is a site which really does need some limited, I say a very limited investigation, simply even just to try and get dating evidence, this would be the site that I personally would like to look at. I mentioned a little bit a few weeks ago that we have this hole in the sort of the middle of the Irish Iron Age. And I know myself and a couple of colleagues have always wondered about the possibility of significant outmigration from Ireland, possibly into Western Britain, possibly into Scotland in the Iron Age. And then when environmental conditions or whatever have improved a little bit, a bringing back in a return, maybe in the early Iron Age, 2nd or 3rd century AD, or maybe 1st, 2nd century AD, and bringing new building styles with them. And that this is part of the things that are stimulating things like the Toynbee colony as a reinvigoration, the Ulster cycle legends, a reinvigoration by a society buoyed up with new blood, literally old blood coming back to bring new blood, if you like, into Ulster. And in the later Iron Age, and that's the backdrop for much of our early medieval stories. And certainly, I think that the Giant Sconce would be an excellent one to look at. Also, would be Dunseverick. Dunseverick, to use its original name. This is a lovely aerial photograph of Dunseverick. Dunseverick, unless you go back, I'm just going to skip. Should I skip back? It might take me ages to get the slides back, but I'll go back at the end to the photograph at the start where I have the geographical spread of these. But Dunseverick's up on the north coast, not far from Dundas Castle, and it is also a rocky outcrop. The fact that these are all rocky outcrops is interesting. I mean, one, rocky outcrops are good places to build on. Let's face it, there's no better foundation than a million tons of granite, so they're useful to build on. But there is nevertheless a predictability to these sites that they all seem to have this sort of like elevated rocky knoll somewhere in either a plain or a promontory. It's the same for much of the west of Scotland. It's showed you Donnard, very similar. Aileach Castle, very similar. Sconce, similar. And here Dunseverick on an elevated rocky outcrop. I mentioned earlier Aileach and the possibility that Aileach might be somehow related to the Cailleach Borough. And one of the things about the Cailleach Borough, and certainly certainly in Scots stories about the Cailleach Borough more than the Irish stories, but she's supposed to fly over the landscape, and she's supposed to drop rocks, giant rocks, from her apron as she flies over the landscape. And this is part of the landscape creation stories. And certainly there do seem to be a number of other sites in Scotland where the Cailleach is associated with rocky outcrops. So whether there's some sort of a combination of practical and not so practical reasons for the choice of these rocky outcrop sites for aristocratic and royal residences in late prehistoric and early medieval Ireland and Scotland. But Dunseverick is a Lidar plan of Dunseverick. You see a lot better Dunseverick here. In fact, I'll just go back to the photograph again. Probably see just at the where I'm circling with the mouse, just at the landward end of Dunseverick, just on the way up to the flat rock, there is the remains of a medieval castle. It's a very small medieval castle. People used to think it was a gatehouse, a bit like maybe at Dunluce, and that the rest of this was a big medieval castle. But actually, it seems that in fact the only bit that really had a proper castellation was just this little bit here, and it's probably some variant of a classic sort of Gaelic tower house of the 15th or 16th century. Most people think it's the 16th century MacDonald tower house, and certainly the MacDonalds were holding it, and they lost it to the O'Neills to Shane O'Neill in the 1560s after the Battle of Rantasia, and then they got it back again, and then they leased this tower house out to the O'Cahans. This is again a Lidar plan of the monument, or the outcrop, several monuments really. You can see down at the bottom here, there's the Lidar of the building, the standing building, and also the Lidar picks up these. And I've used this Lidar, slightly exaggerated the relief here to make it easier to see. But there's a building here, quite a large building, presumably stone-footed building with a side entrance. And there's another sort of like two-roomed building here, which also got quite sharp relief walls. So presumably this is a denuded stone building too. And then we've got various different walls. We've got wall in the interior, and it certainly seems like we've got a perimeter wall, or some sort of a perimeter walling around these sites here. My colleague in Queen's, Paddy Gleeson, has been doing a geophysical survey and also drone surveys of Dunseverick. And he hasn't published the results yet, and I haven't had a chance to see them and talk to him. But I'd be delighted to see what they turn up here. And I think there's a possibility, there's been talk anyway, of maybe doing further field work here. And it would be wonderful to see that happen in the not too distant future. Dunseverick has, like these other important sites, many very ancient associations. The Dunseverick or Dunseverick is mentioned in the Annals of the Four Masters, the ancient bits of the Annals of the Four Masters, the prehistoric bits of the Annals of the Four Masters. And he mentioned that the Annals of the Four Masters is a relatively modern compilation of earlier documents. The Four Masters were four Franciscan friars who, in the early 17th century, seeing that the Gaelic world was on the point of collapse and believing that their culture was in danger, decided to try and get as much of the traditional knowledge and histories of Gaelic culture together and compile it into a set of volumes. And they compiled 4 volumes of ancient and medieval and I suppose very, very early modern history. But the texts they used to compile that were real texts, and most of this is actually repeated in the Book of Invasions as well, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. And one part of the Book of the Taking of Ireland is the divisions of Ireland and how Ireland was divided up at various different times. And of course, the Annals of the Four Masters and the Book of the Taking of Ireland describe, or the Book of Invasions describe the different divisions by each of the waves of invaders, from the Firbolgs and the Tuatha De Danann and the Sons of Meal and all the rest of it. They note each time how it's divided. And in the section where they talk about these things, they mention that one of the divisions after the Sons of Meal, the fifth division of Ireland is divided into 2 parts, with Sorbica residing in the north at Dunsorbica, over which he ruled, and then his brother Cairnma at the south at Duncairnma, which is also sometimes associated with Downpatrick as well. Some of the texts make it more explicit than others that that's Downpatrick. And the Annals of the Four Masters claim that these are the first true kings of Ireland. And I'm never quite sure myself, and I must actually ask someone, I've read it many times, and why the 2 residences of these 2 kings are both in the northern half of the island. And I'm not actually, I wonder about that sometimes, and I wouldn't be able to read that in Irish. And I would like to someone who was a good Gaelic scholar look at it with me and to tell me, is there a slight mistranslation there? And that really it's a split within 2 kings in Ulster, but that's for another day. Again, Thomas McErlean has pointed out from the Ulster cycle tales the associations of the Morrigan with Dunseverick, and also the fact that Dunseverick is the residence of the famous Ulster warrior Conall Cernach. And after Cahallan, Conall Cernach is the next tier of Ulster warriors. You know, if Cahallan is on his own as tier 1, Conall Cernach is very much there at the top of tier 2, put it like that. St. Patrick, as we touched on the last time, is of course associated with Dunseverick, and of course you made a prophecy there. It's the tripartite life of Patrick, and it's Terracon's tripartite life of Patrick. And Patrick comes to Dunseverick, not Dundeverick, and he sits on Patrick's Rock. And that's actually quite interesting, because if you go to Donnard in Scotland, there's of course Columcilla's Rock, where you can put your foot into Columcilla's footprint. And when you put your foot into that's part of the inauguration ritual of the kings of Scots, the kings of Dal Riada. So there was Patrick's Rock, and this rock associated with a saint is a strong indication that this is a royal centre where inauguration may have taken place. And then he consecrates Alcan as bishop at this site. And this is a kind of in a sense, creating a bishop. I mean, a bishop has the status of a prince officially. So in a sense, he was St. Patrick was, by consecrating Alcan there, was picking a fitting place to consecrate his first bishop. And he then meets with Fergus the Great, Fergus Moore, as he's described in the text, the son of Erc. And sorry, I have a little bit tickly throat tonight. I hope not getting, but thankfully you're all isolated by the internet. But Fergus offers lands to Patrick, although says he'll have to ask his brothers, and he had apparently 12 brothers in the fanciful, or 11 brothers. He's one of 12 brothers in the fanciful sort of a tripartite life. But he says, if my brothers respect me in dividing it, And they do respect him, and he gives land to Patrick, and Patrick then is able to construct the church at Armoy on that land. And then Patrick prophesies that Fergus will become not just king of Dal Riada, but as I mentioned a few weeks ago, that he would, the kings and that they would, his descendants would be kings over Fortran forever. And of course, that this prophecy was later fulfilled according to the tripartite life of Patrick by Aidan McGabran becoming effective king of Scotland by force. Of course, since this is a discussion of royal sites, there is, of course, another royal connection with Fergus MacEirk, because Fergus MacEirk is a direct lineal ancestor of Queen Elizabeth II. So there are links to contemporary European royalty as well. And if St. Patrick has his prophecy is still effective, she doesn't have to worry about her succession for a while anyway. So, which is an interesting element of it. But I mentioned the notuli the last time I talked to you. The notuli is a really useful little source from the Book of Armagh, because it's quite a lot older than the tripartite life of Patrick, several centuries probably older. And it mentions, in bullet point form, can only way you can describe it, Patrick and Fergus meeting, and Alcan being made a bishop. As you can see, Irk, Fergus, Moore, Nisa, that's Mac Nisa, possibly the same, and Alcan Feely, and as an Alcan, the son of the foster son of Patrick, and then being made a bishop, episcop, presumably, and then Itelach Kinnell Anguso, and these are the Kinnell Angusa, the clan of Angus, or the family of Angus, are a division of the Dal Riada, and they're a division of the Dal Riada who were not the Kinnell Gabrain, the ones who were in Kintyre and the core of the Scottish kingdom, but at least some of the Kinnell Angusa may have stayed behind in Ireland. And Nem may mean a sacred place. It might just mean, and again, it's something that really needs attention from a really good linguist to have a look at this. But this may mean the sacred place of the Kinnell Angusa. And that would be another reference to Dunseverick as a very special royal inauguration site, if you like. Dunseverick has some Viking associations, a bit like Ella Castle or Aileach. It was attacked twice, and it was mentioned in the Annals of Ulster that it had never been attacked before. Thomas McErlean has actually turned up a story in the Ulster cycle legends where the goddess, the Morrigan, seems to have attacked Dunseverick, but maybe the guys that were writing the Annals, the Four Masters, just thought that was a fairy story. But they said it had never been attacked before, and it was attacked by a combined force of Vikings and Ideal Kinnelone. Which is quite interesting. So it seems that although the Kinnelone may very much have turned against the Norse, and to be honest, more or less wiped them out in Ulster in the early 10th century, it seems that in the 870s they may well have been prepared to take them as mercenaries or something similar and use them in an attack upon Dunseverick. Possibly the Kinnelone hoping to expand their influence farther into East Ulster. Certainly in the early days of the Dal Riadic involvement in Scotland in the 6th and 7th centuries, the Kinnelone had been closely allied to the Dal Riada. In fact, a lot of the Dal Riada's power and success probably became because they had the Kinnelone at their back, the Ideal at their back. Sometimes these terms, I hope they don't get too confusing. The Ideal are the big lordship, if you like, in the northwestern bit of Ireland. The Kinnelone are a branch of a very successful branch, the most successful branch of that family or that lordship, the Ideal. And then the O'Neills are a branch of a branch. They're a branch off the Kinnelone. So it gets quite confusing when you've got these sort of almost interchangeable names, but they are different, and they have nuance and meaning. But there was a second attack in Dunseverick in 924 when many men were killed or captured. Slight aside, there was a tiny excavation done in a cave below Dunseverick a few years ago by my colleague in Queen's, Ruth Logue, and Thomas McErlean. And I looked at the ceramics from it, which is one of my sort of like other sort of archaeological interests. And the ceramics were fascinating because all Irish early medieval ceramics, and to be honest, it's really only East Ulster that uses tableware, ceramic tableware in the early Middle Ages. Most of the rest of Ireland doesn't use ceramic tableware. They prefer wooden, carved, or copper, bronze tableware. But all the tableware is flat-bottomed, bucket-shaped tableware. But in the cave in Dunseverick, we found tableware which was round-bottomed and clearly medieval, clearly early medieval from the radiocarbon dates that we got from the site. It was round-bottomed tableware in the Norse fashion. And we haven't published that. This work's still ongoing, but one of the things we're investigating is that actually either the Norse were staying in the area and actually made some vessels from local fabric in the Norse style, or alternatively they brought some with them from elsewhere. But it's a possibility. But they're very unusual, round bottom early medieval bowls, like none found anywhere else in Ireland. But anyway, later Dunseverick, about 1250 to 1350, Dunseverick seems to have become a manor, a manorial centre. During that period of time, the northern bit of Antrim falls under Norman control. That becomes part of the Earldom of Ulster. The Earldom of Ulster is down South Antrim, most of down South Antrim, not Mid Antrim, interestingly, which stays independent under the O'Flynn's. And then a little strip of North Antrim from really what you would mostly call the Glens and the northern bit of the route falls under Norman control for about 100 years between 1250 and 1350. And during that period of time, Tom McNeill has identified the place name Dunseverick as probably the Norman place name Dunseverick, which occurs in Norman accounts of that period as relating to Dunseverick, and Dunseverick is recorded as a manorial centre, paying monies to the king, or actually to the Earl of Ulster. So it fell out of Norman control with the Great Norman Contraction that happens in the 14th century, really in the aftermath of the Bruce invasion of Ireland. Fascinating series of events when Robert Bruce gets his brother to invade Ireland to assist the O'Neills, essentially, in setting up a new high kingship. And it doesn't succeed in its aims of setting up a new Bruce high kingship with the O'Neills as their kings of Aileach, second in command. But what it does do is it destroys the power of the Anglo-Normans effectively. And they're particularly hard hit in Ulster. And it passes into the hands of the McQuillans, possibly being rented by the O'Cahans for a little while. Then it passes into the hands of the MacDonalds, who build the Tower House, and then the MacDonalds rented out to the O'Cahans, specifically Gilduff O'Cahan, who was the last resident of Dunseverick and was executed in 1653 because of really his involvement in 1641 rebellion. His involvement in 1641 rebellion is largely the fault of an ancestor of mine, Dougal McSparron, who invited him into Dunluce Castle whenever they thought that the Earl of Argyll was coming to attack Dunluce Castle. And when some of the other residents of Bushmills tried to get into the castle, Gilduff and my ancestor barred the castle to them, and there was some sort of a fracas, and a number of people were killed, and it was the first and really one of the few times that the MacDonalds got directly involved in the 1641 rebellion, and it led to Gilduff O'Cahan's eventual execution, but partly because of other actions he did. But it showed up even in where you had a Scottish settlement, if you like, in a sense, like Dunluce, which was made up of both Scottish Presbyterians and Native Irish, and that there were still tensions between Gael and non-Gael, even when you had Presbyterian Gaels and Catholic Gaels effectively joining forces and shutting the doors on Lowlanders who they didn't trust. So it's an interesting series of events. Dunseverick and the Slí Midluachra, another story associated with the site that emphasizes its importance, or may emphasize its importance. The Slí Midluachra is an ancient road which runs from Tara, one of 5 great roads which run from Tara across the Irish landscape, and there were several little branch roads off them. We know it is a real road because we found bits of it occasionally. It was probably, well, the historical records say it was constructed in the 1st or 2nd century AD. A branch of the Slí Midluachra, an excavation that we carried out at Queen's in 2003, got radiocarbon dates from a branch off the Slí Midluachra, which suggests that the road was constructed by at least the 2nd century BC, if not earlier. But Lawler, the sort of archaeologist in the 1930s, suggested that Dunseverick is the likely end spot for the Slí Midluachra, and this has kind of got its way into the literature somehow. But actually, the evidence for Dunseverick necessarily being the end spot of the Slí Midluachra is not entirely. It's compelling but not convincing. You kind of want it to be true, but I don't think he quite sealed the deal. So it could be a number of different locations within a few miles either side of Dunseverick. It was certainly in the route, as it's called, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Dunseverick Castle itself. There are other possibilities. One last little aside I just want to mention. I know we're pretty much out of time, aren't we? I'll just check. What time is it? Because I can't see in my computer. It must be near 9, are we?
It's 5 to 9.
5 to 9. Well, I'll run through this very quickly. I just wanted to mention this because it's not a royal site. It's an important site, but it's not a royal site. But it's also a rocky outcrop site, and it was one which we did an excavation at Queen's a number of years ago. We chose it for a number of reasons. One, it's called Dunmore, which means the Great Fort. It's located on a rocky outcrop. It clearly is Scottish in its style. It has an elevated inner ward, as it was called by Gordon Childe, and a flat outer ward, very much like Dunmull, very much like Donnard, although a little bit smaller than Donnard or Dunmull, but very much the same sort of form. The flat outer ward has definitely been terraformed. You can see that large cleaves of rock have been quarried away and used to make both a flat surface and a curtain wall. Also, the other thing that drew us to it is that it had already been excavated by Gordon Childe in the 1930s, and he had made an interpretation which we didn't entirely agree with. Gordon Childe was a fantastic archaeologist. There's Childe's plan, redone, sort of made a little bit more crisp with technology, but that's Gordon Childe's original plan, more or less. And Childe was a fantastic archaeologist at interpreting archaeology. He was a wonderful theoretician, a great mind, but he couldn't dig for toffee. And what he used to just do is he used to just dig until he hit hard things like stones, and then he would stop and he would get all the finds together and he would sort of say, well, it must be medieval, it must be Norman, it must be, Martian or whatever, And but unfortunately, he missed most of the stratigraphy. That's the soil layers, which gradually build up over time. It's a bit unfair to really blame him. There was a lot less emphasis on that sort of fine, detailed recording and digging back in the 1930s. But he dug here. And he found some ceramics which were later Middle Ages, and he decided it was a late site, and we thought it almost certainly wasn't. So we went back and had another look. We had dug a site quite similar a few miles away and got radiocarbon dates from the 8th century AD, and we thought this is almost certainly a very similar site, and it is a very similar site in many respects. But this is a bit larger and a bit more impressive, and it's got this outer ward and outer gateway area. And another flat area off to the west. I'll just show you the plan of we haven't Lidar, unfortunately, for this site, but there's an aerial photograph, and you can sort of get the impression that, again, it has this central elevated area, which has, you can just about see it here, a wall around it. Then there's this outer courtyard area here, which has a wall around it, and has its flatness enhanced by stones been removed to make a wall. And then there's another sort of area here as well. And we thought we would try and dig some of the areas that Child had dug and see if we could get any dating material that would more tightly sort of bracket the date of this site and tell us a little bit more about it. And so we dug, first of all, on top of the rock, trench 1, over where he had dug before. And as we suspected, he had went down to a certain level and then he stopped. And so we essentially, the layer 104 here he stopped when he encountered layer 104. He really stopped about at the top of layer 106. And he didn't dig beneath that because that sort of formed a flat surface with most of the interesting features. So we got quite, oh, this has gone black on me, sorry. We can highlight that now. Oh, so we got quite a lot of artifacts. We got early medieval rotary quern fragments, and that was very interesting because it was the sort of thing we expected to find if this site had been in use in the 7th or 8th century AD. Around this period of time, 7th century, maybe there was a huge profusion of watermill construction in Ireland. And one of the things you frequently find, and you find in the west of Scotland as well, is that peoples of lordly authority were going round confiscating the hand mills of the peasants, presumably because they wanted you to use the lord's mill or the abbot's mill. So we found fragments of broken rotary querns, and actually somebody did a great study there where they got all the bits of rotary querns from Donnard and set them out together. There were about 30 broken rotary querns, obviously far more than you could ever possibly have used on the site itself, which had presumably been confiscated and brought there. And we found quite a lot of prehistoric flint, and that was interesting, but not entirely surprising because we hoped, by analogy with similar Scottish sites, that we might find an Iron Age layer underneath the early medieval layer. We got 2 radiocarbon dates. It was all we could afford, unfortunately, from this very small, low-budget, community-led excavation project. But we did get 2 radiocarbon dates. From the upper layers, we got a radiocarbon date of the 13th century AD, which didn't entirely surprise us because we knew there was later medieval occupation of the rock, and we expected that. But from the lower layer, we actually got a 9th century BC layer, which, a bit like Aileach Castle, was a lot earlier than we expected, and probably a little bit too early to fit into our preferred model, which was sort of an Iron Age Scottish style dune, sort of continuing in use in the early Middle Ages. So we've a wee bit more head scratching to do. It might just be that material was taken from elsewhere around the rock and used to fill, holes in the jagged bedrocks. The bedrock is very jagged to make a flat surface before the dune, if you like, the early medieval fort was constructed in the 6th or 7th or 8th century. That's a possibility. Or else it was just by chance earlier occupation on the site because it was a prominent point in the landscape and it would always attract people. That may just simply be the answer. And that's just our trench. We find a lovely paved surface in trench 2. lovely place, surface, lovely place for a guard or someone like that to stand and watch out over the sea. The site has the most spectacular views over the North Channel and also into Ballycastle Bay. So it's not really a royal site, but I think it has to have been a site of lordly importance, partly because of its name, its wonderful views, and its situation on a prominent rocky outcrop, and also, as I mentioned several times now, its resonance with dune sites in the west of Scotland. And the more we look here, the more similarity we see, and the more sites we start to see like this, actually. And I think that with time and work, we could maybe plug the gap of some of these sites and plug the gap possibly of the Irish Iron Age as well. So I think I'll call it quits there before anybody else drifts off to sleep. And, I've a few minutes for any questions. I'll try and answer them, or if you know of anything that I've missed, please tell me, because I know there are lots of other sites, and I know many of you are very erudite in these matters. So I'll be happy to take your calls, and I'll put my camera back on. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much, Cormac, for that. That was absolutely fascinating. I have one or two questions, but before I jump in, conscious of the time, does anybody else have any questions that they want to jump in with first? Oh, Peter is waving his hand there.
Two or three odds. Dunmore, Cormac, so are you saying categorically that it's not a Norman Mott and Bailey?
I am pretty certain it's not Norman Mott and Bailey.
That's fair enough. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to bring up was an often overlooked site, Donnard. Donnard,
yes.
Being the fort of the assembly, not the fort of the fair, as is often mistranslated.
Right, yeah. Yes.
And Enoch being prescribed in the Irish Breton laws as an assembly of the tribe.
That's right.
It's interesting. It was interesting to hear you talking about the Aileach in connection with the other sites, because next door to Donnard we have Port Aileach.
Of course, yes, that's right. Yes.
So I'm wondering if, and I actually have been trying to research some of the history of Donnard to prove that our fair, which was originally held up there, grew out of the assemblies in pre-royal charter times, going back to the Breton laws, trying to prove that old Lammas Fair has existed for 2,000 years at least.
Well, I mean, I think you're almost, I would say you're almost certainly right. I'd say it's a very interesting project. I mean, certainly, I've looked a little. I'm not an expert in Enoch's. Paddy Gleeson, who I mentioned earlier, would be the guy to talk to. You may have read some of the stuff actually on Enoch's, but certainly there's I think I have found a possible Enoch site down at Achagallan, and where there's a huge, big sort of 180-meter enclosure, where we found in a Queen's training dig, we found a lot of evidence for medieval craft working, but it was never permanently occupied. It was low intensity, and there were horse races used to be carried out there at Lammas time in the first week of August. And I think that's likely to have been forgotten about Enoch site. And you're right, Lammas. That's the time when these things continued. Same with the Talchinans, well, isn't it? There was Lammas things continued until about 1798. Most of them became suppressed after 1798. So, but that's really I didn't know about I'd never put two and two together. I'd heard the name, but in the Aileach, that's very interesting.
It's just when you brought it up, I thought, bingo. If it's associated with a royal site or important site, we have that connection locally.
Paddy Gleeson makes a couple of suggestions about Enoch sites as well. And I say, do you know his paper?
No, I don't, Cormac.
Let me see now. If this was chat, do you know, could you, if you email me on my Queen's email address,
right,
which is c.mcsparron@qub.ac.uk. You can get it off the my website in Queens. If you email me, I'll email you back his paper. I'll send you a PDF of it, because he talks about the sort of place names that you would find around an Aileach site. He's looked at quite a lot of them, and I think there's a couple in particular. And one is a place name element, Drung, D-R-U-N-G, or Drung. And it basically means the same thing as a large multitude of people. It's the same word as throng or thang, I think, in Icelandic and Norwegian. Yeah. Thang is the same kind of word, a big group of people. And the other one is the word for a green, which is, can't remember. There are several place name terms that he says to look out for in this, and it would be well worth a read. You might find that it applies to, if you looked at an OS map, you might find several of them in the area. I can't remember. There's Strong, and I can't remember the other one. I can't remember, but it'll come to me. But certainly, email me. I'll get you that.
I will do. And thirdly, delighted to hear you mention the Sliemoid Lurca. We have talked about that before at the dig up at Armoy, where we disagreed slightly on the route into Armoy. You were all for the Friary Road, and I was the higher road.
That's right. Well, I think you're probably right. I what you would call it, have changed a lot of my opinions about since then. I think you were right. But I'd love to have the opportunity to use some of the technology nowadays, things like Lidar, and I don't know if you've heard of GIS, Geographical Information Systems. They're brilliant things for overlaying data, and they can even calculate. One of the things that Geographical Information Systems, they can calculate the easiest route to a place.
I worked for the Ordnance Survey in early 1970s. And one of my pet theories an interest was the Sliemoid Lurca, particularly from Dunseverick to Armoy. And I tried to trace the route, using archaeological information, historical information, and I have a fairly robust idea. But I also think there was a very important branch line off it from Armoy down to Ballycastle.
Yeah. I think there are lots of branch lines, and funnily enough, I think standing stones, I'm not saying all standing stones, but quite a lot of standing stones are actually
route markers.
Route markers, yeah. There's one I know, there's a branch off the Sliemoid Lurca, as you know, that would run off up to Carntucher, and then there's a number of places on it where there are standing stones, and other possible branches off that seem to be defined by standing stones, and ring forts as well. Very often along the likely routes of the Sliemoid Lurca, the ring forts are scattered either side of them. You can almost imagine the postman going along.
Thanks very much, Cormac. Apologies to everybody else for monopolising you there.
We have, I think, Dennis and also John. Dennis, will we go with you first there?
Thank you. I was wondering about the actual location of a couple of the sites. First of all, the giant sconce, is that actually what's known as Sconce Hill?
That's it, yes, that's the one.
That's right, okay, and the Dunmore, is that on Rathlin Island?
No, sorry, no. Dunmore is just beside, just Murlough Bay is really just around the corner. And actually, I'll see if I can. It would be right Fairhead, basically. Fairhead. I'm trying to think if I could bring up a map, but sharing screens is probably quite difficult. But hold on 1 second.
I was just looking at both of the locations on Google Earth, and that there seem to be sort of similarities in both cases, but obviously the Dunmore one wasn't the one.
I'll see if I can bring it up here in Google. Oh no, that's not right. The IT skills are letting me down.
It's right on top of Fairhead. I cycled up there last week, and it's at the end of the road. You can't go any further.
Very good. I'll find it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, did you have a question there?
Yeah. It was just where exactly it's doing. Brian, maybe you could explain again where exactly it is. Dall, man.
Well, if you were going from Ballycastle, you get to Ballavoy and you follow the signs for Fairhead. So you turn off the main Cushner Road
Yes.
up towards Fairhead, and you basically keep going left. And you go up, and the road eventually is a dead end. But just before,
All right, I can see the map of it now. I've got it now.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. You basically keep following road signs for Fairhead, and there's actually a local farmer has a car park where you can park your car and then you walk 100 meters to the dune. It's on your left, but it's literally right at the end of the road.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I just realized that I've been to it about 3 or 4 times, and never actually realized, what the name was or made the connection there during Cormac's talk. Are there any other questions there? No? Cormac, I have one. It's possibly too big a question to answer fully here, but you made it very clear that Dunmore is not a royal site. What makes a royal site?
Well, I think you're right. It's quite a big question, but I'll make a few comments. Really, it's not a full answer, but a few comments. The first thing is what is royalty, and we sometimes, say that the early medieval Ireland has 150 kingdoms, and to some extent, I think that's partly because we are misunderstanding the complexity of the term royal and the term king, and that it had slightly different meanings in early medieval Ireland than it has for us nowadays. So if you take something like the Song of Dermot and the Earl, which is a Norman French romance about Ireland and the coming of the Normans to Ireland, which was composed in the late 12th century. And in the Song of Dermot and the Earl, they say, that the Irish say there are many kings in Ireland, but really there are only a handful of actual Irish kings who have royal power. And it explains to the French viewer or the French reader, sorry, the reader in French rather, not necessarily French, but the reader in French, that these kings, they may use the term king, but many of them are just local lords. They're like counts or dukes, and only a few of them have actually real royal power. So I think that the first thing is that although you're talking about a country which in theory at any given time had, maybe up to 100 or 150 aristocrats who may have had the term king somewhere in their title, that only a very small percentage of those were actually serious contenders for any sort of genuine royal power authority. And those people wanted association with particularly elevated, not elevated in the geographical sense, but sites which are elevated by their antiquity and their importance. And I think for something to be a royal site, it must have an association with a major overkingdom or major seriously aristocratic figure, not just a minor aristocrat. And it has to have some level of deep antiquity, which enhances its status. I think that those are probably the two main criteria. And I think that in the case of Dunmore, although it may have real antiquity, it was not thought of as a particularly special place on outside a purely local level. And I think if you think of Dunmore as something like a manorial centre, I'm not necessarily saying Norman manorial centre, but if you think of it in that context as the important place over that area of a few miles, then that's significant. But somewhere like Aileach or Dunseverick are places that would be known across the whole of Ireland, certainly maybe even across the whole of Ireland and the west of Scotland. Everyone would have heard of Aileach, everyone would have heard of Dunmore, and would mention the the important kings who had dwelt there and who names were associated with. So I think that is, in a roundabout way, there's no litmus test, but it's a series of elements that go together to make a royal site. That would be my understanding of it.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Last chance for a call out for questions. No, perfect.